Hello, welcome back. I think right now what I want to do, it's quite important, is that I address some of the code duplication I've got. If we look inside views here, we can see here when we import a feed, we're fetching a URL, we're saving the podcast, we're saving the episodes, and we're redirecting. In the admin, we're doing something very similar, and then again in our tests, we're doing something very similar. We're taking data, passing it, and saving it. So I think what I need to do is pull this code out into a shared location, refactor it, and then if I need to make a change in one, I don't have to go through and update all three of these methods, because there is actually a subtle bug inside one of these views where we've not actually wrapped this in a transaction, which is a bug that I actually encountered in an earlier episode. So we save the podcast here, but if something happens during the processing and saving of the episodes, and that blows up, the podcast will be saved without any of the episodes, when really it's an all or nothing kind of approach, I think. I don't want the podcast to be saved if none of the episodes can be correctly passed and saved to the database. So to kind of demonstrate that, I'm just going to throw in like a bogus field. So I'm going to give this just a silly value. If we go to our site here and I look up talk Python to me, if I try and subscribe to this, it's gonna throw an exception because we've passed a field to episode that doesn't exist. So our parser has returned this, and we've used that parsed data to try and create an episode. But what's happened is if we go to podcasts, we've actually saved this podcast with no episodes. So that's not what we want in this scenario. So really we need to wrap it in a transaction. So at the end of this refactor, hopefully we should be able to fix that bug. I don't think it's actually present in admin. I think admin probably wraps itself in its own transaction, but it's also certainly present in the tests as well. So I think in parser we probably just want a method like ingest podcast, where you give it data, which can be like bytes, I guess. In fact, let me just open things in a split here, so that whenever we drag these over, whenever we pass data to this ingest podcast, we want to do a couple things. We want to pass the podcast and the episodes and save them both to the database. So let's say import ingest podcast, and then we're just going to call ingest podcast, and this is going to return a podcast on the resp.data, and then all of this can be pulled into here. And we're going to just replace resp.data with regular data. Okay, I'm happy with that. So let's see if this is all working well. We did delete this. Cool. Let's try going back here. Talk Python. Subscribe. Podcast is not defined. Interesting. Yes. So from models, import podcast episode. If only I was using a proper IDE. Okay, so yeah, we're hitting this bogus field. Now if we go to admin, talk Python is still there with no episodes. So we want to import transaction here, and we want to say with transaction.atomic. So probably, at which point do we want to do this? Like the parsing or the saving? Let's just wrap this bit with transaction atomic and indent u. Now let's try this and see if it works again. So delete, talk Python, subscribe. Okay, so now we're hitting this exception again, but talk Python should not be there, which it isn't. Cool, so we've fixed that bug, and so now we can go back into the parser and get rid of that bogus field. and make it so we can add talk Python again. And to prove to you that I don't think this was a bug in the admin here still has the old code that isn't wrapped in a transaction. We're going to try and do this again. In fact, that will work because I just removed that episode code. So let's add this. Let's add that stuff back in. So the bogus field is there, and we're going to do this through the admin and see if the admin is still susceptible to the same like transaction bug. So podcast, talk Python. Let's see if this creates the podcast without the episodes. Yeah, so talk Python isn't here, so admin therefore isn't susceptible to that bug. But I would like to reuse this code nonetheless because it is useful. So we can say ingest podcast, and we just want to say ingest podcast with the resp.data here. Is that what we want? I think, yeah, that's literally it. So let's quickly test that. Again, pass podcast, talk Python, save. Okay. Nice. That seems to have worked. And then finally in the tests, we can say ingest podcast. And here, all we literally want to do is just check that the ingest logic works and doesn't throw an exception. So it can be manage.py test. That seems to be working. And yeah, that's basically our refactor complete. Now we have a single location that just takes data, passes that data, and in a transaction creates the podcast, saves it to get the primary key, and then we can save all the episodes. I think at some point we're going to have to go through and bulk create these episodes, potentially, especially for things like the Stuff You Should Know podcast that goes back to 2008. I'm worried that this will create separate queries, but we can optimize that later if it starts to look pretty slow. So yeah, in the next episode, probably going to start looking at either more parsing or introducing Django social auth so you can log in with Google. So see you in the next one.